Why does the United States still use weapons that were created over 100 years ago? The United States military is one of the most modern on the planet. Even from their own perspective, they are the most modern military in the world, having a plethora of truly modern weaponry with few rivals in the world. However, we also see that the United States also has weapons and vehicles in service that are really very old. Even some weapons are over 100 years old since they were created, and most of them don't even have a short-term replacement planned. Today, we will try to find out why these weapons are still in service and if they will be replaced soon. So first, let's review all these old weapons that are still in service. A very old weapon that almost always goes unnoticed is the 11 Gustaf recoilless rifle. Introduced in 1946 to replace all Allied anti-tank weapons. What the engineers who created the Gustaf 1-1 did was to take the German technologies used in the Panzerstreck, the American bazooka, and the Payat to create a definitive anti-tank weapon. This curiously uses rifling to spin its anti-tank projectiles, contrary to the German and American anti-tank systems that use fins to stabilize their projectiles. This can launch guided missiles that can even destroy targets 1,000 meters away, and if it is operated by 2 soldiers, it can fire up to 6 rockets per minute. Which is fantastic. The Gustaf has a price of $20,000, and its most expensive rounds cost $3,000. It contrasts a lot with the Javelins, whose operating cost has been one of the $100,000. And remember that the most modern versions of the Gustaf are really effective, and they are even being used in the current conflict in Ukraine. The most modern version is the 1-4 put into service in 2015. This, like the previous updates, it remains essentially the same weapon as the Gustaf 1 only, with many operational improvements to adapt them to modern battlefields. And there are no plans to replace them, so these have been in service for over 80 years. A heavy machine gun that I'm sure everyone will know is the Browning 1. .250 caliber machine gun created by John Browning to put the United States Army at the forefront with anti-aircraft machine guns in 1920. Based on the previous design, 1-1, it was adopted in 1930, just in time for World War II, where it served wonderfully being equipped on armored vehicles and ships. It has an incredible range of 1,800 meters and 7,000 meters maximum range, with a rate of around 600 shots per minute, which is quite decent. This has almost 90 years in service, and it's close to 100 years since it was created, and it is not expected to be out of service soon. It is one of the oldest weapons that are in service in the U.S. Army. Even there are weapons like the Call of Duty, 1911 pistols that were in service for almost 80 years. And currently its upgrades are in limited service in some special forces like the Delta Force. In the United States Army, not only are there weapons that have been serving for close to 100 years, but we also have airplanes and rotary wing vehicles. One of the most famous is the C-130 Hercules, put into service in 1955. This was created from the bad experience obtained from civilian planes adapted to carry cargo and logistics in the Korean War. They could not carry enough weight and were susceptible to damage from the excessive effort they were subjected to, all this due to piston motorizations. The United States created the Hercules precisely to carry logistics. It reaches speeds of 650 kilometers per hour and has a range of 3,000 kilometers. Being able to fly at 240 kilometers per hour with cargo. It can also transport 90 soldiers when used for transport, and it is quite versatile. So much so that it has the ability to land on aircraft carriers, although this is not its specialty. It can also be armed with 25mm rotary machine guns and 40 and 105mm cannons. A program has currently been started to find a replacement for this excellent plane, called the Next Generation Air Transport Program 110. So at least we have 2 more decades of seeing the AC-130 Hercules flying in the skies, serving in the United States Army. A rotary wing helicopter that I'm sure we all know and that in fact appeared in the thumbnail of this video is the CH-47 Chinook. This was developed between 1957 and 1960 and put into service in 1962, and its main intention was to replace the Sikorsky CH-37 Mojave. It turned out to be Mojave. It proved to be very useful in Vietnam, being able to transport a large number of troops through the jungles, being much more efficient than the Bell UH one-way, being surprisingly agile and able to avoid anti-aircraft defenses. It can fly at 320 kilometers and at 280 at cruising speed. This is widely used to transport troops, but it is particularly useful for transporting heavy things, being one of its most impressive images. The Chinook can drag up to 11 tons of weight to 1,500 meters high, also being able to carry 56 soldiers with all their equipment. Probably the most outstanding performance of the Chinooks was in the Afghanistan conflict, where it could fly through mountains, dropping soldiers off on cliffs without landing, being one of the most incredible images we have seen of these fantastic helicopters. There is already a program to replace these helicopters called Future Vertical Lift, but it is just starting, so we have at least a couple more decades of these helicopters. I think one of the most impressive planes still serving in the United States is the B-52 Stratofortress, created as a long-range bomber in 1952 and put into service in 1955. It can fly at 15,000 meters with a maximum speed of 720 kilometers. It was produced shortly after the Second World War with the aim of having the ability to attack distant targets with nuclear or non-nuclear weapons without the need to refuel in other countries. It fulfilled its design objective wonderfully, being able in its initial test to attack a small atoll called Bikini with a nuclear warhead. This was almost 9,000 kilometers from the American base where the B-52 took off. It can attack targets that are 14,200 kilometers away without any problems. It served in Vietnam, being able to unload all kinds of explosives in this conflict, and even made the farthest bomber attack in history. 7 of them took off from Louisiana to bomb targets in Iraq and then return home. The mission lasted 35 hours and is one of the most incredible bomber missions we've seen. They tried to replace it with the B-1 Lancer, a plane that turned out to be less effective and inadequate for the necessary functions. And they also tried to replace it with the B-2 Spirit, a stealth bomber, which, while it was particularly more effective, turned out to be more expensive to produce. All these weapons and aerial vehicles have lasted decades in service, and that's because they perform their functions so well that it's hard for any modern weapon or vehicle to replace them, considering that modern weapons and vehicles are generally more expensive to produce. All of these have in common that they are extremely simple, cheap, and effective weapons and vehicles. And in fact, this is what is needed to be considered a good military vehicle or a good military weapon. It's impressive that vehicles and weapons that are 60, 70, and 80 years old can still serve without problems, and that their effectiveness has not been reduced by technological advancement. It's an example that in the military world, better technology is not always better,